Imagine mist still clinging to the Palatine Hill, the low roofs of a handful of wooden huts dark against a pale dawn. A boy drags a clay jar to the riverbank. Women chatter about the price of grain. Beyond the bend of the Tiber, men argue over the boundary stones of small fields. Somewhere in that fog, a story is being told for the thousandth time. How a city began, how two brothers fought over a hill, how a name was given and a wall thrown up, and how a modest place would one day set laws for millions. That image, rough, intimate, yet opening outward to something vast, is the key to the question that follows. Why does Rome still fascinate us today? Why do we return, again and again, to its stones and stories, to its mixture of brutal politics and ingenious engineering, to the idea that a cluster of villages could become the center of a world? This is not merely antiquarian curiosity. It is a search for roots of things we still live by: law and language, roads and ruins, the memory of institutions that shaped how many societies think about power and order. To answer that, we must travel from mist to marble, from myth to bureaucracy, from the intimate acts that make a community to the large-scale systems that hold an empire together. We promise a complete journey, the legends that gave Rome identity, the experiments of the Republic, the violence and innovation of expansion, the architecture and law that endured, the crises and reinventions that followed, and the long shadow Rome casts across centuries. If you enjoy long, careful journeys through history, subscribe and stay with us as we follow the arc from village to empire. The first stop is a story told as legend and as identity. According to tradition recorded by later Roman historians, a twin ship of contradiction lies at Rome's founding. The tale of Romulus and Remus, children of a Vestal named Rhea Silvia, and, in some versions, of the god Mars, has all the elements that stick in human memory: abandonment, survival, divine favor, and fratricide. The twins are said to have been set adrift on the Tiber, rescued and suckled by a she-wolf on the riverbank, raised by a shepherd, and, in adulthood, to have quarreled over the exact site of the future city. When Romulus killed Remus, legend says he became the first ruler. The place took his name. This is legend, not literal history. Archaeology shows small settlements on the Palatine, Capitoline, and neighboring hills by the middle of the first millennium BCE. Clusters of huts, tombs, pottery shards, simple hearths. People exchanged goods along the Tiber, grazed animals on the slopes, and confined themselves to the local world of oxen, metalworking, and ritual. But the story of the twins mattered as more than a bedtime tale. It helped later Romans explain their origins in terms that made sense: courage born of hardship, violence that both destroys and establishes, divine connection that justified human authority. Founding myths are never neutral facts. They are imaginative blueprints. They give a people reasons to see their institutions as rooted in a sacred past. From myth, Rome slid into a form of monarchy, kings whose historical profiles are hazy, sketched by later writers into archetypes. The traditional list names figures like Romulus himself, who, in narrative, organizes the first citizen warriors and establishes the early urban boundary. Numa Pompilius, associated with religious institutions and calendar reforms. Tullus Hostilius, a warlike ruler who doubled down on martial virtue. Servius Tullius, credited with social reforms such as a primitive census that reorganized Rome's military and voting orders. And finally, Tarquinius Superbus, the last king, whose arrogance and brutality are said to provoke the revolt that overthrew the monarchy. These kings, as portrayed in Roman memory, are a combination of plausible local leaders and rhetorical figures for the virtues and vices later Romans wanted to name. Numa, pious and slow, represents the need for ritual and law to steady a city. Tullus, violent, embodies expansionist impulse. Servius suggests administrative sense. Tarquin exemplifies the danger of concentrated royal power. The story culminates in the episode of Lucretia, her assault by a prince of the Tarquinian family and her subsequent suicide, which, according to later Republican historians, sparked public outrage. Lucius Junius Brutus and others seized that outrage as a foundation for action. The monarchy was expelled, and in its place, the Romans set up a system intended to prevent single-person rule. Whether the details happened exactly as written is debated, yet the transformation mattered in Rome's political imagination. The replacement of king by magistrates with limited terms and the elevation, however messy, of collective rule. From this point forward, the city imagined itself as a res publica, a public thing, governed by offices, laws, and a division of roles. That phrase, res publica, will echo through centuries as both a claim and ideal, and it begins with a foundational act, a conscious attempt to bind power with procedures. The new republic did not emerge as a polished constitution, but rather as a pragmatic set of practices and tensions. 2 consuls, elected annually, would hold the chief magistracy instead of a king. The Senate, originally a council of elders and leading men, continued as a body of experience and influence, advising the magistrates and directing foreign policy. At first, this Senate was more oligarchic than democratic. Wealthy families, later called patricians, held the lion's share of office and prestige. Opposing them were the broad masses, artisans, farmers, soldiers, who would be called plebeians. These were not modern class labels, but categories embedded in ritual and law, in marriage and religious privilege. Over time, the distinction hardened into political conflict, the struggle of the orders. Why did this matter so much? Because the Romans, in a handful of centuries, tried to build a common political language that could encompass both elite privilege and popular claims. They experimented with checks and balances that felt, to them, like protective architecture. The annual turnover of the consuls was a built-in limit on individual ambition. The collegial nature of magistracy, 2 consuls, multiple praetors, various lesser officials, made single-person rule difficult in theory. Yet practice revealed the limits of designs. Ambition, wealth, and the demands of warfare blurred the lines between office and influence. One of the most consequential moves toward modernity was the decision to put law into writing. The 12 Tables, compiled, by tradition, in the mid-5th century BCE, were not a complete legal code in the modern sense, but a set of public formulas that recorded customary rules, procedures for trials, debt, family law, and property. Before the Tables, legal knowledge was largely the preserve of an elite of priests and magistrates who claimed interpretive authority. Making law public and fixed removed some of that monopoly and provided a reference point for claims of justice. The 12 Tables became, symbolically, the moment when Rome said, "The rules of community will be visible to all citizens." That act of transparency is one reason modern readers see in Rome a recognizable ancestor for rule of law concepts. Alongside legal innovation was a political innovation of a different kind: Rome's methods of expanding influence across Italy. Unlike some empires that sought immediate colonization and outright replacement, Rome tended to create networks of alliances, varying degrees of citizenship, and local self-government. Defeated communities might be bound by treaty, obliged to supply troops or pay tribute, yet often allowed to keep local elites in place. Over time, Rome granted differentiated rights. Latin allies might receive limited citizenship. Others would be full citizens with full rights, including the vote and the capacity to hold office. This patchwork made Rome's growth less an imposition than a system of graded inclusion. It created ties of obligation and interest that could be militarized when Rome needed soldiers or invoked to organize tax and service. The Italian peninsula, therefore, became a stage for Rome's slow but inexorable consolidation. The early Republic also honed military practice. In these decades, the Roman army was not yet the professional force of later centuries. It was a citizen militia raised for campaigns and then disbanded. Soldiers fought in formations that emphasized discipline, cohesion, and collective maneuver. The Roman approach was pragmatic. When confronted with new enemies or new terrains, commanders adapted. That adaptability would become a hallmark of Roman military culture, a willingness to learn from foes, to borrow techniques, and, when necessary, to innovate. It is here, in the raw mechanics of institutions and expansion, that the modern fascination begins to take shape. We are drawn not only to the spectacle of conquest, but to the slow, iterative crafting of systems. Written law where there was oral custom, magistracies that checked power but could be subverted by ambition, alliances that created imperial bonds without immediate empire. These are processes we can recognize in our own institutions. Law as a bulwark, governance as a set of fragile balances, cultural assimilation as both pragmatic and coercive. Consider a small microscene to make this palpable. Picture the Forum in an early Republic morning. Merchants calling out the price of oil and cloth. A magistrate mounting the rostra to pronounce a legal decision. A line of rustic-looking men, farmers wearing cloaks patched at the elbow, waiting to be enrolled for the levy. A young noble arrives, his toga still stiff from the tailor, and he passes an older plebeian who was fought in a campaign against a nearby city-state. The older man looks tired but vindicated. He has heard that his neighbor received a small parcel of land after service. Between them lies a political argument about debt and indebted farmers, a subject that will grow deeper and darker in later years. The Forum is not merely market and courtroom. It is a crucible where social tensions, legal claims, and military obligations meet. Those tensions are crucial to understanding the arc of Roman development. As Rome's territorial footprint expanded, so did the complexity of its economy and the strains on its social fabric. Smallholders sometimes sold their land and drifted to the city. Wealthy elites amassed large estates worked by slaves captured in war. Commerce intensified. Coinage and contracts became common. The urban population swelled. All of these changes would feed into political disputes. Who should bear the cost of military service? Who controls public land? Who benefits from the spoils of expansion? The Republic's early centuries are also a story of crises met with institutional improvisation. When neighboring powers threatened, Rome often leaned on flexible diplomatic arrangements and adaptable military practices rather than systemic overhaul. The Samnite Wars, for instance, tested Roman endurance and tactical thinking in the rugged interior of the peninsula. Whether in pitched battle or a long siege, Rome learned to mobilize resources and to co-opt defeated communities by offering rights sufficient to hold them within Rome's orbit. Step by step, patch by patch, Rome wove together an Italian commonwealth, unequal, often coercive, but resilient. This is the point at which the small political experiments of the early Republic begin to exert influence beyond Italy's hills. Trade routes widen. Greek colonies in southern Italy and Sicily expose Romans to Hellenic culture, architecture, philosophy, art, and new administrative models. The Mediterranean, long a network of isolated coasts and island polities, starts to feel like a stage where larger powers can compete. Carthage, an older mercantile power built on maritime commerce and fortified ports, already controls much of the western Mediterranean. Rome, primarily a land power to this point, is on a collision course with a rival whose strengths are at sea. Before that collision fully unfolds, however, Rome's internal story accelerates. Legal reforms become a source of political contestation. The plebeian tribune emerges as a powerful voice defending ordinary citizens, and the Senate's authority continues to be both a steadying influence and a focal point of elite ambition. Public rituals and religious observance remain central. Magistrates perform rites to secure the favor of the gods before a campaign. Omens are read in flocks and lightning. The calendar is managed to harmonize civic life. Religion, law, and politics are tightly intertwined, another reason modern observers find Rome so compelling. It was not simply an accumulation of institutions, but a culture in which symbols, ceremonies, and statutes reinforced each other. We can pause to ask again, why does all this matter to us now? Partly because Rome's institutions exemplify a paradox we still inhabit. The attempt to create stable, impersonal rules to govern a community, while relying on human actors who bring the full range of virtue and vice to the public square. The Romans tried to build safeguards, annual offices, collegial magistracies, written laws, yet they also left space for patronage, for charismatic generals, and for social inequality. The tension between structure and agency is timeless. It helps explain why narratives of Roman politics, from the honor of early consuls to the ambition of later commanders, keep captivating modern minds. As Rome's reach extended, that tension would be tested in new ways. External wars demanded resources and long-term commitments. Internal inequality created pressures that could be leveraged by ambitious leaders. Military success produced wealth that rewired social relations. These are the ingredients that will soon shift the Republic from an experimental polity to a state capable of projecting power across the Mediterranean, an escalation that invites both admiration for Rome's capacity to adapt and unease at the costs of empire. We end this segment at a hinge, the moment when Rome, no longer content with dominance of its immediate hinterland, turns outward. Across the sea, a commercial and naval power named Carthage commands trade and colonies. On the Italian mainland, Greek cities pulse with a culture Rome admires and fears. Roads stretching from Rome open the way for legions and merchants alike. The question that now hangs in the air is as concrete as a river boundary and as charged as the memory of a founding murder. Can a polity built on communal rule and incremental inclusion master the art of empire without losing the forms that made it a republic? Soon, the answer will be tested on fields and waves not yet described here, by clashes that will force Romans to become sailors, by generals who will cross oceans of allies and enemies, and by laws that will be stretched to the breaking point. The next chapter takes us from Italy to the wider Mediterranean, where Rome's encounter with Carthage will reshape both powers and the course of history. The clash with Carthage began like many ancient reckonings, with trade and insult, with rival networks of power and commerce that could not be contained. Imagine a Roman assembly in the mid-3rd century BCE, merchants counting amphorae, senators debating whether to send ships across the Tyrrhenian, a young officer listening for orders. The Mediterranean was not yet a Roman sea. It was a crowded weave of Greek, Punic, and indigenous lanes. Carthage, a mercantile superpower based in North Africa, defended a far-reaching commercial empire with fortified harbors and seasoned mariners. Rome, built for land war, had to become a naval power almost overnight. The First Punic War, 264 to 241 BCE, was in many ways a school of hard lessons. Rome learned at sea by trial and error. A notable Roman contrivance, often reported by ancient writers, was the corvus, a boarding device that turned naval engagements into close-quarters fights where Roman infantry excelled. The corvus is emblematic. It shows Roman adaptability, sometimes clumsy but relentlessly pragmatic. Over decades, Rome threw ships, men, and money into the struggle. The cost was high, but the consequence decisive. Carthage retreated from Sicily, and Rome began to build a maritime presence. With Sicily established as Rome's first province, the logic of empire advanced: strategic islands, safe sea lanes, and the income to sustain larger ambitions. The Second Punic War, 218 to 201 BCE, is the story that most dramatically tests Rome's character. Hannibal Barca, Carthage's greatest general, enters this narrative as both strategist and legend. His crossing of the Alps with war elephants, an image that still quickens the imagination, was not merely a theatrical gesture. It was a calculated gamble. He fought a brilliant campaign on Italian soil, defeating Roman armies in battles like Trasimene and Cannae, where the Romans suffered catastrophic losses. Ancient sources dwell on the horror of these defeats and on the tactical genius that produced them, yet they also emphasize Roman resilience. Polybius, who studied Rome closely, argued that Rome's institutions, an ability to levy new armies, the steadiness of reserves, and the determination of citizens allowed Rome to endure when others might have collapsed. The Roman reply is personified in figures like Publius Cornelius Scipio, later called Scipio Africanus. Rather than seek to beat Hannibal in Italy at every turn, Scipio struck at Carthage's interests in Spain and eventually carried the war to North Africa. The Battle of Zama, 220 BCE, ended Hannibal's campaign and marked the moment Rome decisively displaced Carthage as the dominant Western power. The war left an imprint beyond the battlefield. It widened Rome's horizons, accelerated military reform, and intensified the flow of wealth and slaves into Italian elites' hands. These transformations would ripple for generations. The Hellenistic East then presented a new set of challenges and opportunities. Macedon, the successor kingdoms of Alexander's generals, and the rich city-states of Asia Minor were different kinds of polities from Carthage. They were sophisticated in royal administration and steeped in Hellenic culture. Rome's encounters with them were often diplomatic and legal rather than purely martial. The Macedonian Wars and later the absorption of Pergamum into Roman hands converted Greek polities into Roman provinces. Rome did not immediately impose wholesale Roman customs. Instead, it governed through a patchwork of client kings, senate decrees, and provincial governors. Greek intellectual life profoundly affected Rome's elite. Greek tutors taught Roman youth, and Hellenic art and literature became standards of refinement. Yet, political power increasingly flowed through Roman channels. The world's cultural center shifted toward a Mediterranean interconnected under Roman hegemony. War and expansion did more than redraw mats. They restructured Roman society. The continued inflow of captives from conquest fed an expanding slave economy. Large agricultural estates, latifundia, worked by unpaid laborers became common, often at the expense of small freeholders who lost land after prolonged service or debt. Urban migration swelled Rome's population, increasing demand for grain, housing, and entertainment. Inequality grew visible and combustible. Into this pressure cooker stepped political actors who would try to harness popular grievances for reform or personal gain. The Gracchi brothers, Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus, stand at that juncture. They were not radicals in a modern sense. They were aristocrats who sought land reforms intended to restore a class of small farmers and to redistribute public land held by the elite. Their proposals, however, threatened entrenched interests, and political conflict escalated. Both brothers met violent ends, Tiberius in 133 BCE and Gaius in 121 BCE, and their deaths mark a crucial inflection point. Ancient writers remembered the episodes as the collapse of previously held norms. Political violence, once rare and exceptional, began to creep into public life. Modern historians debate the depth of systemic change these episodes caused, but few dispute that the Gracchi exposed how domestic inequality could destabilize political practices designed for an earlier era. Military transformation accelerated the breakdown of old checks on personal power. Gaius Marius, a talented general and 7 times consul, reformed recruitment by opening the legions to the landless poor and promising veterans land and pensions. This provided Rome with a more professional army, but it also shifted soldiers' primary loyalty toward their commanders, who delivered rewards, rather than toward the state abstractly. The loyalty of troops to generals could be and was mobilized in politics. Lucius Cornelius Sulla crossed a new threshold when he marched his legions on Rome itself in 88 BCE and again in 82 BCE. Sulla's subsequent dictatorship and the proscriptions that marked his rule normalized political purges and established precedents that others would imitate. Politics had become militarized. This militarization is the context in which Julius Caesar emerged. Caesar's career combined military prowess, rhetorical skill, and a flair for public spectacle. His conquest of Gaul, 58 to 50 BCE, created an immense personal following through victories, loot, and veteran colonization. In 49 BCE, facing a Senate that favored his rival Pompey, Caesar crossed the Rubicon River, an act the sources describe as irretrievable. The phrase, crossing the Rubicon, has become shorthand for passing a point of no return, and in Caesar's time, it marked the beginning of a civil war that would shatter republican conventions. Caesar's victory, his appointment as dictator, and his assassination in 44 BCE reveal the tragic irony at Rome's heart. The Republic's institutions could create extraordinary leaders, and those leaders could then use the very authority those institutions sought to disperse to concentrate power. The aftermath of Caesar's death was a decade of renewed wars. The drama of Antony and Octavian, of shifting alliances, and the decisive Battle of Actium, 31 BCE, closed the Republic's final chapter. Octavian, soon to be known as Augustus, masterfully merged the rhetoric of restoration with the reality of concentrated authority. He preserved republican forms, senate, magistracies, but reoriented the system so that real power rested in his hands as princeps, the first citizen. Augustus's settlement inaugurated the Principate, an imperial system that combined autocracy with a veneer of republican legitimacy. His rule brought relative peace after decades of civil conflict and initiated an era often termed the Pax Romana. The Pax Romana, a prolonged period of comparative stability across much of the Mediterranean and Near East, allowed Roman institutions, law, and infrastructure to develop at scale. Roads linked cities, aqueducts carried life-giving water across valleys, amphitheaters and baths organized public leisure, markets facilitated trade. Law matured into a sophisticated system administered by jurists whose opinions would form the basis for later compilations. The growth of a professional bureaucracy and a standing military presence in provinces enabled Rome to govern a diversity of peoples. Yet beneath the order were persistent tensions. The empire relied on slavery and coercion. Provincial subjects navigated complex hierarchies of citizenship and privilege. Elites practiced a patronage economy that bound the powerful and the dependent into networks of obligation. The imperial centuries were also ages of remarkable culture and architecture. Walk the city under Augustus and his successors, and you would see monumental programs meant to awe and to integrate, forums that were civic stages, roads that announced Roman presence, temples that fused local cults with imperial imagery. The Julio-Claudian dynasty, Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, Nero, offers a study in contrasts. Administrative competence mixed with episodes of cruelty and misrule, as recorded by Roman historians. The Flavian dynasty that followed restabilized the imperial house after civil upheaval. Vespasian and his sons invested in public works like the Colosseum, built on the site of Nero's private lake, symbolically reclaiming urban space for the people. Perhaps the most admired stretch of the imperial era is the rule of the so-called five good emperors: Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, Marcus Aurelius, under which the empire reached its greatest territorial extent and enjoyed cultural efflorescence. Trajan's campaigns extended Roman rule into Dacia. Trajan's column stands as a narrative in stone. Hadrian consolidated borders and built his wall in Britain. Marcus Aurelius, philosopher king, fought on the Danube frontier and left behind meditations that still speak to readers today. Good here means effective governance more than moral perfection. These rulers managed administration and succession in ways that minimized civil war and allowed civic life to flourish. Daily life for most Romans, whether in Rome itself or in provincial cities, centered on neighborhood, commerce, and ritual. Many urban residents lived in insulae, apartment blocks that could be precarious but vibrant. Markets sold oil, fish, grain, and vegetables. Baths functioned as social hubs where classes mingled in regulated spaces. Festivals and religious observances punctuated the year. Slavery was woven into almost every aspect of production, from agriculture to household labor to skilled artisanship. The moral ambiguities of this system are stark. Slavery underpinned prosperity and public amenities, yet it was a system of human bondage with terrible human costs. Rome's law had an especially lasting edge. Jurists developed legal principles, contracts, property law, and procedural rules that later generations would codify and adapt. The 12 Tables had been an initial step toward public law. Centuries later, jurists' opinions and imperial rescripts formed a dense legal culture. The idea that law could be written, argued, and refined by professional interpreters, rather than hidden in narrow priestly secrets, was a Roman gift to later European polities. This legal legacy would survive in medieval and modern codes and exert influence on the development of Western legal thought. Yet, the imperial story is not a straight line of growth. The 3rd century CE brought a convulsive crisis. Plague, economic strain, barbarian incursions, and the proliferation of claimant emperors produced a chaotic scene in which central authority was often ephemeral. Armies proclaimed emperors, coinage suffered debasement, and provinces swung between loyalty and local power. Modern historians often point to multiple interacting causes rather than a single catastrophe. Demographic shocks, monetary troubles, pressure on frontiers, and administrative overstretch combined to stress the system. Out of crisis came transformation. Diocletian, reigned 284 to 305, instituted sweeping reforms intended to stabilize the state. He reorganized the empire administratively, dividing it into smaller provinces and larger dioceses, and established a tetrarchy, rule by 2 senior and 2 junior emperors to reduce the frequency of succession crises. He also reformed taxation and attempted to shore up the economy through price edicts, which had mixed results. Diocletian's reign increased the ceremonial nature of imperial office. The emperor was no longer merely primus inter pares, first among equals. He became an elevated figure who required ritual reverence. These changes were pragmatic responses to a crisis of scale. They altered the visual and administrative grammar of imperial government. The next major shift was Constantine. Ancient sources recount that Constantine fought at the Milvian Bridge in 312 CE, and that he experienced a vision, an event historians debate in meaning and interpretation. What is clear is that Constantine recognized Christianity's political significance and took steps to legitimate it within imperial structures. The Edict of Milan, often associated with Constantine, granted tolerance to Christians and ended official persecution as imperial policy. Constantine also founded a new capital at Byzantium, renamed Constantinople, positioning a reoriented imperial center on the Bosporus. Under Constantine and his successors, Christianity increasingly became a force within imperial life, altering institutions, patronage patterns, and cultural symbols. Treat this not as theological destiny, but a social and political realignment in which a once marginal movement found elite patronage and legal security. As the 4th and 5th centuries proceeded, pressures on the western provinces intensified. Movements of peoples, Goths, Vandals, Franks, Alemanni, and others, interacted with a weakened imperial infrastructure. The Gothic Wars and the catastrophic defeat of the Romans at Adrianople in 378 CE highlighted the changing military balance. Alaric's sack of Rome in 410 CE was a psychological blow that reverberated through the Mediterranean world. Though contemporaries cautioned against seeing it as an absolute end, the city had been sacked before. Later raids and the Vandal sack of 455 further undermined the West's aura of invulnerability. The deposition of Romulus Augustulus in 476 CE by the Germanic commander Odoacer is a convenient marker for the fall of the Western Roman Empire, but it is better read as the culmination of decades of administrative collapse, interruptions in tax revenue, and shifting military loyalties. The idea of a single decisive fall obscures the long, messy process by which Western provincial life was transformed. Meanwhile, the Eastern Roman Empire, what later historians call the Byzantine Empire, maintained political continuity for centuries. Centered in Constantinople, it preserved Roman law and administrative habits in new forms. Justinian, reigned 527 to 565, stands out as a figure who sought to restore Roman glory. His legal commission produced the Corpus Juris Civilis, a codification that would deeply influence later European legal traditions. Justinian's military commander Belisarius reconquered parts of North Africa and Italy, and the emperor's grand project, the Hagia Sophia, rose in Constantinople as an architectural marvel binding religious symbolism to imperial power. Justinian's reign, however, also reveals the limits of reconquest. His campaigns were costly, the plague struck his population, and the empire's energies were stretched thin. The later centuries saw the Byzantine world persist and transform. The Islamic conquests of the 7th century took large swaths of Eastern Roman territory, reshaping the Mediterranean's political map. Centuries later, the Crusader diversion culminated in the sack of Constantinople during the Fourth Crusade in 1204. A traumatic rupture enforced by Western Christians upon a fellow Christian polity. The Latin occupation fractured Byzantine continuity until the Byzantines reclaimed Constantinople in 1261. The city survived as an imperial capital and cultural beacon, although diminished. In 1453, Mehmed II captured Constantinople, decisively ending the millennium-long Roman imperial story in a political sense. The fall of Constantinople closed a chapter, but even then, the cultural and legal echoes of Rome persisted in law, art, and memory. Why does this long, complicated sequence continue to grip us? Part of the answer lies in scale and continuity. Rome was not merely a polity that built walls and roads. It created systems that could, with adaptation, remarkably durable. Law written down, roads laid out, legal concepts argued in courts, these are durable artifacts. Latin as a language provided the skeleton for Roman tongues and furnished vocabulary for law, science, and religion. City planning, with forums, aqueducts, and public entertainment, set standards for urban life that recur in later centuries. When we step into a modern courthouse or trace legal concepts like testamentary freedom or contract obligation, we often encounter Roman antecedents that traveled through Byzantine, Islamic, and medieval European receptacles into modern systems. Yet fascination runs deeper than institutional inheritance. Rome embodies paradoxes that we continue to ponder. It is the place where remarkable engineering and administrative genius coexisted with slavery and coercion, where a vocabulary of civility and law sat beside spectacular violence, where republican experiments gave way to imperial settlement. These contradictions invite reflection because they mirror dilemmas we still face. How to balance freedom and security, how to organize diverse polities under a shared legal frame, and how to remember heroes whose virtues are entangled with violence. There is also the power of story. Romans and later authors who wrote about them were masters of narrative. Founding myths like Romulus and Remus, the tales of great generals, the drama of assassinations, and the spectacle of triumphs produce durable images. Literature and art have kept these images alive. Livy's narratives of conquest, Plutarch's lives showing character and fate, Tacitus's trenchant observations about power, and Suetonius's vivid biographies of emperors. Later epics borrowed, adapted, and deployed these stories for their own ends. Renaissance patrons and Enlightenment jurists alike found in Rome a mirror for their projects. The story of Rome is, in that sense, a repository of meaningful metaphors for authority, ambition, and civic life. Archaeology and the physical remnants of Rome also exercise an almost magnetic pull. Walk the Forum today, or the decayed, layered ruins that people call the Roman Forum, and you feel time folded in stone. Aqueducts still carry water in distant places. Roads trace routes that are still in use. Ruins punctuate landscapes across Europe, North Africa, and the Near East. That tangible presence renders Rome not simply historical, but present tense. The past is visible in the cityscape and in artifacts preserved in museums. The tactile quality of ruins, marble worn by steps, inscriptions carved into stone, anchors abstract ideas about law and empire in real materials. We are drawn to the tangible because it makes questions about governance, justice, and human aspiration concrete. Another thread of fascination is the Roman capacity to invent institutions that could be adapted by others. The Roman legal mind, municipal governance, roads and military organization, and vocabulary of citizenship proved transplantable. Medieval and early modern rulers who sought legitimacy often reached back to Roman precedents. Modern nation-states drew on Roman law and administrative vocabularies when fashioning judicial and bureaucratic apparatuses. For many in the West, Roman models provide templates for statecraft and cultural reference points, which explains part of the persistent investment in Roman study. But fascination is not uniform or unproblematic. Modern readers must wrestle with the moral costs embedded in Roman achievements. Imperialism, slavery, religious persecuting policies, and the occasional display of cruelty are parts of the record that demand sober attention. To admire Roman engineering is not to excuse subjection. To praise legal sophistication is not to ignore the ways law could entrench inequality. The historian's task is to hold these truths together, to appreciate technological and institutional genius while acknowledging human suffering that accompanied them. Imagine now a sequence of small scenes that compress centuries into images that arrest us. A legion marching under standards, dust rising as boots strike the road. Merchants in Ostia bargaining over grain. A judge in a provincial court ruling in Latin before an anxious crowd. A mother in a small provincial town hearing of her son's death on a distant frontier. The dome of the Hagia Sophia catching a sunrise in Constantinople. A medieval scribe copying a Roman legal maxim by candlelight. A 19th century idealist studying Latin inscriptions in an excavated forum. These images are why Rome's passé is never merely past tense. It is a continuing presence in cultural memory. The question remains practical as well as poetic. How did Rome's administrative inventions survive and transmigrate? Part of the answer lies in the empire's bureaucratic habits. Even when political forms shifted, administrators and provinces continued routines: bookkeeping, tax assessments, legal adjudication. The codification efforts, most powerfully Justinian's Corpus Juris Civilis, gathered and organized centuries' worth of legal thought, making it available as a coherent corpus that medieval jurists could rediscover, comment upon, and adapt. When scholars in Western Europe re-engaged Roman law in the 12th and 13th centuries, they found a toolkit that could be retooled for new polities, which is why legal institutions in modern Europe often bear Roman fingerprints. Language remains another durable repository. Latin was a living tongue in the Western Mediterranean, evolving into rustic roots and giving birth to Romance languages: Italian, French, Spanish, Portuguese, Romanian. Even where Latin ceased to be a vernacular, it remained a language of learning, law, and liturgy for a millennium. Its vocabulary undergirded scientific terminology and administrative language in later eras. The continuity is both practical and symbolic. Latin provided a lingua franca through which learned communities could converse across centuries. Architecture and urban planning become visible legacies too. Roman engineers solved practical problems, bringing water across valleys, moving tons of building materials, creating durable roadbeds that later societies could emulate. Arches and vaults allowed larger enclosed spaces. Concrete let builders shape forms previously impossible. The basic urban templates, streets, sewers, public squares, and civic buildings remains recognizably Roman in many European and Mediterranean towns. Even when medieval builders repurposed Roman spolia, or when Renaissance architects revived Roman forms in new classical languages, the physical grammar of Roman urbanism persisted. Memory and myth-making deserve a final note. Rome's narrative was repeatedly rewritten by those who inherited its story. Medieval rulers claimed Roman law to justify sovereignty. Renaissance humanists found in Roman antiquity art models and political metaphors. Modern statesmen and writers have invoked Rome to praise empire or to warn against hubris. The elasticity of Rome as a symbol, capable of signaling republican virtue or imperial tyranny, ensures its persistent utility as a cultural touchstone. This mutability is part of the fascination. Rome is not a single story, but a mirror in which successive generations see their concerns reflected and refracted. If we return to the ruins and to the books, the final answer to our central question is not simple but composite. Rome fascinates because it combined scale with invention, because it created institutions that variously protected and oppressed, because it produced enduring cultural forms, and because it offered narratives rich enough to be retold for new purposes. We are drawn to the paradoxes, the republic that birthed empire, the law that underwrote inequality, the engineers who built aqueducts while the city chained slaves. The fascination is intellectual, moral, aesthetic, and emotional. It asks us to admire and to judge, to learn and to remember. Standing today amid fragments of marble, one can feel the pull of that history. The battered steps and the curved silhouette of an amphitheater evoke crowds, law courts, and markets. Museums hold personal objects, a child's toy, a soldier's fibula, a magistrate's seal, that humanize a distant society. The Latin inscriptions, even when eroded, insist that words survive stone. The legal phrases, the road networks that still shape trade routes, the languages that echo Latin roots, all are reminders of continuities that outlast empires. Our last scene is quiet and reflective. Picture dusk on the Palatine, the same hill where, according to tradition, Rome started as a few huts. Now birds wheel above scattered ruins. Tourists and locals pass among arches built by long-dead hands. A scholar closes a notebook. A child runs through a colonnaded walkway. A repairwoman carries a lantern to a maintenance job near an aqueduct. History here is not a set of static relics, but an active conversation between past and present. We ask questions and receive fragments. We see systems and persons who shaped them. We feel the tension between admiration for human ingenuity and sorrow for the costs those achievements entailed. If this journey has kindled your curiosity, there are more paths to follow. Deeper looks into Roman law, focused studies of particular emperors, archaeological tales from different provinces, and comparisons of Roman institutions with later models. For now, if you found this exploration meaningful, like and subscribe, and consider watching the accompanying series where we unpack law, warfare, and daily life in greater detail. Rome fascinates because it refuses to be wholly contained. It is myth and archive, ruin and system, story and tool. We keep returning because those contradictions are instructive. They show what human communities can make and what they can break, and how ideas old as the Palatine can still shape how we live and think.